Welcome to 21st Century Dating Decoded. We're making modern love simple. Get ready to decode your love life. Brought to you by Mingle.
Imagine you're staring at your phone in the pitch dark. It is 2 a.m.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Right. And the only light in the room is that harsh blue glow just illuminating your face.
Definitely.
And you are typing out this massive multi-paragraph text message. You are detailing your deepest, darkest childhood trauma, or, maybe your most profound insecurity. And you're sending this to someone you met on an app barely 3 months ago.
It's just pouring your heart out.
Exactly. And you hit send. You don't even blink. You are completely 100% emotionally bare in that moment.
Which feels totally fine at 2 a.m.
It feels completely fine. But then the sun comes up, and the very next morning, that exact same person texts you back.
Oh.
Yeah, and they are warm, they are receptive, and they ask a really simple question. They just say, hey, do you want to grab a casual cup of coffee down the street this afternoon?
And cue the panic.
Suddenly, your stomach just completely drops, your heart rate spikes, your palms get sweaty, and you feel this visceral, paralyzing surge of dread.
It's a full-on threat response.
It is. So why is that? Why is the prospect of a lukewarm latte in broad daylight so terrifying when sending your deepest secrets into the digital void felt like, well, nothing at all?
It is the absolute defining paradox of modern human connection.
Mm-hmm.
We are living in an era where we have never been more technologically tethered to one another, right? But simultaneously, we are so psychologically terrified of actual physical proximity that we treat a coffee date like a literal threat to our survival.
Wow, yeah.
We're craving intimacy, but we're just terrified of the vulnerability required to actually get it.
Welcome to 21st Century Dating Decoded. I'm Alice.
And I'm Zach.
And today our mission on this deep dive is to really unpack the intricate and honestly the often contradictory psychology of modern connection. We are putting a magnifying glass on the tension between digital intimacy and offline anxiety.
Right, and we are also looking at the bigger picture of how human beings assess safety and navigate sexual boundaries. And we are going to look at that process across literally every stage of life.
And we really aren't exaggerating when we say every stage of life. The stack of sources we are pulling from today is, it's vast, and honestly, it's a bit eclectic.
A bit eclectic is an understatement.
Right. But rather than just giving you a dry list of studies, we are going to weave together a story. And it starts with this massive sociological data on what researchers are calling the modern sex recession.
Yeah, we are going to look at the psychological profiles of how digital natives, so Generation Z, how they navigate romance.
Ugh.
We'll explore some modern therapeutic modalities, too.
And just to show you how this quest for boundaries never actually ends, we are even going to decode the strict orthopedic guidelines for returning to physical intimacy after total joint replacement surgery.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
It is so fascinating because the truth is the cultural narrative you see on television or, on social media regarding modern romance, especially for younger demographics, it is completely at odds with reality.
Oh, totally.
Pop culture desperately wants you to believe that everyone is engaging in endless hookups with this wild, carefree abandon. But the actual data tells a radically, almost shockingly different story.
Yeah, we really need to jump straight into the deep end here by looking at the numbers. Because, well, the numbers do not lie.
Let's do it.
So let's look at the gold standard for this kind of data, which is the General Social Survey. This is often abbreviated as the GSS. And it is this massive, long-running project conducted by NORC. That's the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago.
So this isn't just some random internet poll on a magazine website.
Exactly, no. This is a highly rigorous, scientifically weighted sociological survey that tracks the behaviors and the attitudes of the American public over decades. So they look specifically at U.S. adults aged 18 to 64.
Okay.
And what they found is that the share of people in that massive demographic who are having sex at least once a week has just absolutely plummeted.
Like, how much of a drop are we talking about?
Let's go back to 1990. In 1990, 55% of adults in that age range were having sex weekly. But as of 2024, that number has dropped to just 37%.
Wait, 37%? That is a massive cultural shift.
It really is.
We aren't talking about a slight dip or a temporary anomaly caused by a bad year. A drop from 55% to 37% represents a fundamental rewiring of human behavioral patterns.
Yeah, millions upon millions of people are simply opting out of physical intimacy on a regular basis.
And here is where the narrative really flips on its head, because the specific demographic leading this so-called sex recession, it isn't the elderly. It is Generation Z. We were talking about anyone born from roughly 1997 onward.
Which brings us right back to the core paradox you brought up at the very beginning.
Right.
Because if you think about Generation Z, this is the very first cohort of human beings to have high-speed internet and hookup apps essentially pre-installed on their smartphones from the exact moment they hit adolescence.
Yeah, the access is unprecedented.
They have instantaneous, entirely unregulated access to pornography in their pockets at all times. They are immersed in a hypersexualized pop culture environment. I mean, you just have to look at the Billboard charts right now.
Oh, definitely.
They are driving massive streaming numbers for artists like Sabrina Carpenter, whose music is heavily drenched in blatant sexual innuendo and these themes of liberation.
Right, the cultural air they breathe is absolutely saturated with sex.
But the actual physical practice of it is dropping like a stone.
So we have to ask the obvious question, what does this all mean? Why are the most seemingly sex-positive, digitally liberated, and hyper-connected young adults in the history of our species just, well, staying home?
So the researchers and sociologists point to a perfect storm of converging factors. And the easiest, kind of laziest critique is to just blame screen time.
Right, the old phones are ruining everything argument.
Exactly, as if looking at TikTok simply drains the libido mechanically. And while the digital environment is certainly a massive factor, the root causes are much deeper.
What is they finding?
First, we are looking at skyrocketing rates of clinical social anxiety. You have an entire generation whose nervous systems are constantly on high alert.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Then you have to factor in the lingering, really profound impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We tend to want to put the pandemic in the rearview mirror, but for Gen Z, those lockdowns fundamentally disrupted the most crucial developmental years of their adolescent social lives.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the timing for them was awful.
Right, the time when you were supposed to learn how to clumsily flirt or read body language and navigate rejection in the school cafeteria, all of that was replaced by isolation and Zoom squares.
You literally lose the reps. You don't get the practice of being a messy human in a low-stakes environment. But the sources also highlight that it's not just psychological trauma, right? It's a massive shift in political and cultural awareness, too.
Yeah, the cultural landscape has been completely terraformed. The Me Too movement was a necessary and long overdue reckoning, but it also fundamentally recalibrated how young people view the actual mechanics of intimacy.
It forced a hyper-awareness.
Yeah, exactly. A hyper-awareness of consent, of power dynamics, and of the severe social and emotional risks associated with physical boundary violations.
Right.
And when you combine that hyper-awareness with the economic realities they face, you see young people consciously shifting their life priorities. They are pouring their limited energy into career survival, trying to maintain their fragile mental well-being, and, remarkably, a huge portion of them report that they are simply prioritizing sleep over the effort required to go out and pursue a sexual encounter.
Prioritizing sleep. And honestly, looking at the state of the world right now, I completely get it. Burnout is just a systemic condition at this point. It goes so far beyond just needing a nap.
Yeah, people are exhausted.
There's actually a quote in our source material from author Carter Sherman that absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I read it. Sherman points out that we are conditioned to think about sex as this highly private, intimate thing that happens between two people behind a locked bedroom door. But in reality, the terms of our sex lives, the actual context in which intimacy occurs, are being set in public schools, by local school boards, in courtrooms, in state legislatures, in Congress, all the way up to the White House.
Wow. It completely contextualizes the underlying anxiety, doesn't it?
Well, it's really good.
Intimacy is no longer viewed as just a private biological act or even just a bit of fun. It is heavily weighted with profound cultural, political, legal, and social implications. Reproductive rights are in flux, gender dynamics are fiercely debated, and the social consequences of a misstep are permanent in a digital age.
Because there's a record of everything.
Exactly. So when you look at dating apps, the promise was that having total access to millions of potential partners would lead to an explosion of intimacy. But human neurobiology just doesn't work that way. Total access hasn't led to more connection, it has led to profound decision paralysis.
Right.
When the terms of engagement feel overwhelmingly complex and the stakes feel astronomically high, the natural evolutionary human response is to pull back. We retreat into safety.
It is like being completely starving. You walk into this massive, opulent, all-you-can-eat buffet. There are 10,000 dishes from every corner of the globe. But as you grab your plate, you suddenly realize you are profoundly terrified of getting food poisoning.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
And there is no way to know which dish might be tainted. So you stand there, completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of options, paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice, and you ultimately just put the empty plate down and walk out the door. You have infinite choices, but the perceived risk completely overrides your hunger.
And to push that analogy even further, the food poisoning they are terrified of isn't just a bad date.
Right.
It is the potential for a severe emotional boundary violation. It's the risk of a non-consensual encounter, the threat of public humiliation via a screenshot, or honestly, even just the agonizing discomfort of profound social awkwardness when you don't know the script. So they walk away from the buffet. It is an act of self-preservation.
But humans are inherently biologically social creatures.
Right.
We are wired for connection. I mean, we cannot survive in total isolation. So if they are walking away from the physical buffet, how are they finding sustenance?
Well, that brings us to one of the most fascinating concepts in our research today, a psychological phenomenon known as mediated vulnerability.
Let's get into this because this is wild.
To understand this, let's dive into an anecdote provided in the sources about a young woman named Maya Lin. She's 22 years old, and she serves as the perfect case study for this generational shift.
Okay, Maya Lin.
Maya is incredibly communicative. She regularly dispatches long voice memos, direct messages on Instagram, and those massive late-night text paragraphs we talked about earlier.
The 2 a.m. deep trauma texts.
Exactly. She sends these to acquaintances and potential romantic interests with total emotional transparency. She will lay out her deepest insecurities, her fears about the future, her family trauma. But the moment one of those people suggests taking the interaction offline, just a simple, real-world coffee date, Maya reports feeling absolute dread.
Because in the digital space, Maya is the director of the movie. She has total, unyielding control over the environment.
That is the exact mechanism at play here.
Yeah.
Clinical cyberpsychologists refer to this behavior as mediated vulnerability.
Mediated vulnerability.
Yeah, it is the practice of using text-based, asynchronous communication to provide a crucial layer of psychological insulation between yourself and the other person. And that word, asynchronous, is the key to everything.
Meaning it's not happening live.
Right. It means the communication does not happen in real time. You do not have to reply the second you receive a message. You can draft your response in the Notes app. You can edit it. You can delete 3 sentences that sound too desperate. You can carefully curate the exact emotional tone you want to project before you ever hit send.
You can literally pause the interaction to regulate your own nervous system.
Precisely.
Like if someone texts you something that triggers your anxiety, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, it might light up. But because you have a screen in front of you, you can put the phone down, walk away, take deep breaths, let your prefrontal cortex come back online, and then craft a calm response.
Yeah.
You absolutely cannot do that sitting across a table at a coffee shop. If someone triggers you in person, you have to react in real time with all your messy micro-expressions on full display.
Exactly. And that real-time processing is terrifying if you haven't built up the tolerance for it.
Mm-hmm.
For older generations, so millennials, Generation X, baby boomers, digital communication platforms like early cell phones, AOL Instant Messenger, or even early dating sites were viewed primarily as transactional utility tools.
Like, meet me at the mall at 6.
Right. You use the technology to figure out the logistics of where and when to meet up in real life because everyone universally understood that the actual bonding, the real chemistry test, had to happen face-to-face. But for digital natives, that foundational script has been entirely inverted. The virtual environment is no longer the waiting room. It is the primary arena for foundational emotional bonding.
It's like they are building the entire emotional foundation of a house. Putting up the walls, installing the plumbing, all completely in the cloud before they ever even look for a physical plot of land to build it on.
That's a great way to look at it.
And the cyberpsychology research in our sources backs this up beautifully. The researchers discuss this concept of intimacy bridges. The data shows that Gen Z isn't trying to replace face-to-face intimacy entirely like some dystopian sci-fi movie. Instead, they are using their screens as a pathway, a literal bridge, to safely cross the chasm of their own social anxiety.
And the research published in the journal Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking offers a really nuanced view of this. They found that Gen Z couples who learn how to successfully integrate their digital intimacy with their in-person intimacy actually report incredibly high relationship satisfaction.
Wait, really? So it actually works?
It does. They don't just put the phones away when they're together. They maintain that intimacy bridge. They might curate a collaborative social media presence or use specific apps designed for emotional check-ins, allowing them to communicate difficult feelings through the safety of the screen, even while sitting on the same couch.
But the mechanisms of how they disclose information are so radically different depending on the medium they are using.
Oh, entirely.
We have this fascinating study from Press, that's Science and Technology Publications, and they looked specifically at sexual self-disclosure. They wanted to know how people reveal their most intimate desires and boundaries, comparing the offline world to the online world.
What did they find?
Well, in the offline physical world, the researchers found that disclosure is heavily measured by a person's willingness to verbally discuss sexual topics. It's the classic negotiation, sitting down and actually vocalizing your likes, your dislikes, your fears, and your boundaries to your partner.
Right. It requires looking someone in the eye and using your physical voice to navigate the vulnerability.
Yes, but in the online context, the Press study found something totally different. Digital sexual disclosure doesn't rely on verbal negotiation at all. It heavily features uploading visual content. It's sharing pictures, memes, or highly curated texts that reference revealing personal sexual behavior. It becomes performative. It is visual evidence of sexuality put out there for a very specific, curated audience, like a close friend's story on Instagram.
Which beautifully highlights how the architecture of the digital environment changes the very definition of what it means to be open. They're revealing highly intimate, often explicit details about themselves, but they're doing so from behind the bulletproof glass of a smartphone screen.
Yes.
They're completely mitigating the immediate risk of physical rejection. If someone doesn't like the photo or reply to the story, it hurts, but it's not the same as being verbally rejected while standing naked in front of someone. What they are deeply terrified of is a phenomenon researchers call the offline mismatch.
The offline mismatch. Meaning the fear that the profound connection they feel digitally is just a mirage.
Precisely. They have spent months building this intense intimacy pledge, but there is always a lingering terror that the person they've bonded with via text will not translate into a safe, comfortable, or attractive physical reality. They fear the chemistry won't exist, or worse, that the physical presence of the person will feel threatening.
Okay, I have to push back on this entire framework, though.
Okay, go for it.
As we talk about myelin and these carefully drafted texts, I keep asking myself, is this actually vulnerability at all? Or is it just a highly sophisticated, curated performance of vulnerability?
That's the big question.
Doesn't the barrier of the screen make it dangerously easy to completely fake emotional depth? Think about it. If I have 20 minutes to sit on my couch and draft the absolute perfect, most empathetic, culturally aware text message response to someone's trauma, I am not really showing you who I am in the messy reality of the moment. I'm showing you my PR representative. I'm showing you the person I wish I was.
I completely understand why you would look at it that way, and it is a major point of debate among psychologists right now. It is undeniably a curated performance to a certain degree.
Yeah.
You are filtering out your immediate, perhaps less empathetic knee-jerk reactions.
Right.
But I would argue against the idea that it's entirely fake or invalid. We have to look at the neurobiology of the person on the receiving end.
Okay, what happens there?
To the user receiving that perfectly crafted message, the feelings elicited are incredibly real. The subjective experience of feeling seen, validated, and understood triggers the exact same neurochemical reward, so the release of oxytocin and dopamine, as an in-person conversation would. So while you might be communicating with a PR representative, the bonding that occurs in the brain is genuine.
But doesn't that just set everyone up for a massive fall?
How so?
Because eventually the PR representative has to clock out. If you build a relationship entirely on the premise that I will always respond with perfectly calibrated empathy, what happens when we are finally at that coffee shop? You say something triggering, and I react with immediate, unfiltered frustration because I didn't have 20 minutes to draft my response.
Yeah.
The friction between the digital avatar and the real human seems like it would just shatter the whole illusion.
That is the exact friction causing the offline anxiety. You have hit the nail on the head. The foundation they have built is emotionally potent, but incredibly fragile under the weight of real-world spontaneity.
Right.
And because this foundational bonding happens entirely in this asynchronous controlled environment behind a screen, the actual milestones of a relationship look completely unrecognizable compared to the cultural scripts of 20 or 30 years ago. The old map of, meet, date, go steady, get engaged, it's burned.
Which naturally leads us into the murky, highly confusing, and culturally ubiquitous waters of the talking stage and the modern situationship.
Oh boy, yes it does.
Let's attempt to map this new territory. We have to start with the talking stage because the definition of this term has completely mutated.
Definitely.
Historically, especially back in the early days of Tinder or OkCupid, the talking stage was a very brief, clearly defined window. It was the 3 or 4 days where you messaged back and forth on the app just long enough to agree to meet for a drink. It was a temporary holding pattern.
Right. It was essentially a rudimentary screening process to verify you weren't about to meet someone dangerous.
Exactly. A quick vibe check. But Generation Z has expanded the definition of the talking stage to cover a massive, indefinite expanse of time. We have data in our sources from a breakdown by the dating app field, and they note that the talking stage now covers the entire psychological period, from the very first message sent all the way to the official defining of the relationship, the dreaded DTR conversation.
DTR, yes.
And the wild part is the talking stage can go on for 6 months.
Half a year. Half a year of intense emotional and often sexual communication without ever attaching a label to it. And very often, this extended talking stage doesn't lead to a traditional relationship at all. It morphs into its final static form, the situationship.
The situationship. If historians look back at the romance of the 2020s, this will be the defining term.
Absolutely.
Let's explicitly define it for anyone lucky enough to have avoided one. A situationship is an ongoing romantic, emotional, and often physical engagement between two people that deliberately and stubbornly eschews explicit labels and long-term commitments. It is a relationship in every practical sense except in name.
And it requires a very specific psychological posture to maintain. There is a deeply insightful study in our sources focusing on emotional ambivalence among Gen Z dating app users.
What did they find?
The researchers interviewed people actively engaged in situationships, and the participants consistently emphasized an exploratory, quote-unquote, go-with-the-flow mindset. They are not dating with the intention of finding a spouse or moving in together. They are actively seeking emotionally charged, intimate connections that purposefully defy traditional romantic codes and expectations.
But we have to look at the underlying mechanics here because I don't buy the narrative that young people just woke up one morning, looked at monogamy, and decided they hated commitment.
No, definitely not.
They didn't invent the situationship in a vacuum. Cold, hard economic pressures are silently steering this entire cultural ship. When we look at the reality of this generation, we are looking at a cohort that is absolutely crippled by predatory student debt. They're facing an astronomical, almost completely inaccessible housing market. They are dealing with intense daily anxiety about career stability in an age of corporate layoffs and artificial intelligence.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. When we examine the traditional relationship escalator, right, the milestones society tells us to hit, almost all of them are deeply tied to financial capital.
Exactly.
Moving in together requires securing a lease, paying first and last month's rent, and combining resources. Getting engaged requires buying an expensive piece of jewelry. Getting married involves funding a massive social event. These milestones require a baseline level of financial stability and optimism about the future that simply does not exist for a huge portion of this generation. Therefore, practical, insurmountable financial barriers unconsciously manifest as emotional barriers.
And when you add the modern digital panopticon to those economic fears, the pressure is immense. The sources note that performance anxiety within relationships is at an all-time high.
And not just sexual performance.
Right, this isn't just sexual performance anxiety, it's romantic performance anxiety. Young people today have hyper-awareness of psychological terminology. They are constantly consuming content about relationship best practices, toxic traits, gaslighting, and narcissism. Plus, they are constantly comparing their own messy, behind-the-scenes reality to the aesthetically perfect, heavily curated couples on their social media feeds. You aren't just dating your partner, you are dating against the idealized concept of a perfect relationship.
Which is precisely why sociologists argue that the situationship is a feature, not a bug, of modern dating culture. It is a highly rational adaptation to an irrational environment.
Right.
The situationship allows participants to satisfy their immediate, hardwired biological and psychological desires for physical intimacy and emotional connection, but it allows them to do so without taking on the perceived massive risks of a formal investment. In their minds, if there is no official label, there's no official relationship. And if there's no official relationship, there is no catastrophic failure when it eventually ends.
I understand the logic, but honestly, it feels like a massive exercise in self-deception.
How so?
Are we just dressing up a profound fear of commitment and abandonment in
And that illusion of control is paramount for a generation living in a world where macroeconomics, global politics, and social structures feel wildly, terrifyingly out of their control. The situationship is the one space where they can dictate the exact terms of engagement, even if those terms are just, well, we have no terms.
But eventually, the laws of physics apply. Even digital natives hiding behind screens and ambiguous labels eventually have to put the phones down. If they want physical intimacy, they have to occupy the same physical space.
Right, they have to actually meet.
And when they do finally decide to take that step into the physical realm, the sources show us something truly unexpected. They have a surprisingly rigid, almost conservative vetting process, and they possess truly fascinating, seemingly contradictory views on a potential partner's sexual past. We have to talk about the concept of body counts.
Yes, this specific slice of data is incredibly revealing because it shatters a lot of assumptions. We are looking at a comprehensive survey discussed on the Steve Harvey Morning Show. The survey asked a large cross-generational sample of adults what they consider to be an acceptable number of past sexual partners, what pop culture refers to as a body count for a new romantic partner.
And the generational divide here gave me absolute whiplash.
It's wild, right?
It is. Gen Z, the youngest group in the survey, the ones leading the cultural charge on gender fluidity and sex positivity, are highly, fiercely conservative in this specific metric. The survey found that Gen Z overwhelmingly prefers partners with a body count of exactly 1 to 2.
1, 2.
Just 1 or 2 previous partners in their entire life. Meanwhile, millennials, who are currently aged roughly 30 to 45, are far more flexible, generally preferring a partner to have had 3 to 5 past partners. And Generation X and the baby boomers, they are the least concerned of all, widely accepting 5 to 10 past partners as a completely normal, healthy history.
The psychology behind this vetting process is what makes it so compelling. We have to ask, why is the youngest, most theoretically sex-positive, progressive generation demanding the lowest possible body counts?
Yeah, why?
If you listen to the sociological experts analyzing this survey, they point out a crucial distinction. In the past, a high body count was heavily stigmatized as a moral failing, usually rooted in religious or patriarchal frameworks. But Gen Z isn't generally treating sexual history as a moral judgment of a person's soul or worth. Instead, they have repurposed the concept of a body count. They're utilizing it purely as a risk assessment metric in a high-anxiety world.
Because their primary mode of operation is staying home and carefully, painstakingly vetting their options through digital intimacy bridges, they are already delaying the physical aspects of a relationship. They wait until emotional trust is explicitly established over text.
Correct. And when they finally cross that bridge, they want absolute assurance that the person on the other side approaches physical intimacy with the exact same level of caution, gravity, and neurotic risk assessment that they do.
Right, they want to know they match.
Exactly. To a highly anxious 23-year-old, a potential partner with a very low body count signals a shared worldview. It signals that this person also prioritizes emotional safety and deep connection over the chaos and risk of casual physical encounters. It is empirical proof, in their eyes, that you aren't reckless with your body or theirs.
And there's a massive payoff for this intense, prolonged vetting process. The sources indicate that once that physical boundary is finally mutually crossed, Gen Z experiences profound confidence. Because they have spent weeks or months building the emotional foundation, establishing clear consent protocols, and verifying physical and emotional safety, the actual physical act of sex becomes incredibly freeing.
It does.
They explore with far fewer limitations than older generations because the perimeter has been so heavily secured.
It creates a fascinating paradox. Extreme caution and rigidity on the front end lead directly to extreme openness and liberation on the back end. But again, that liberation only exists within a highly secured, heavily vetted perimeter.
I understand the logic of risk assessment, but I have to call out the glaring irony here. This is the generation that streams the most explicit, sex-positive music on the planet. They champion fluid sexuality, they dismantle puritanical gender norms, and they publicly celebrate sexual autonomy better than anyone else in history.
Oh, my God.
Yet, behind closed doors, they are demanding their partners have the sexual resume of an 18th century monk. Just one previous ex. How in the world do they reconcile that massive cognitive dissonance without their brains breaking?
It is absolute cognitive dissonance. You're not wrong. But it makes perfect sense if you view their behavior exclusively through the lens of anxiety rather than the lens of morality or ideology.
Okay, tell me more.
Their media consumption, the Sabrina Carpenter songs, the explicit TikTok trends, the celebration of hookup culture, that is all aspirational. It is performative. It allows them to safely explore themes of wild, reckless freedom from the secure distance of their headphones. But in their actual lived reality, the physical, emotional, and social stakes feel far too high to actually gamble. They want the aesthetic of wild freedom, but they demand the reality of absolute security. They want to wear the leather jacket, but they want it lined with bubble wrap.
That makes total sense. They want the thrill of the roller coaster, but only if they have been given an engineering degree and allowed to personally inspect every single bolt and weld on the track before they strap in.
Exactly.
Speaking of inspecting the track and utilizing metrics and numbers games to control dating anxiety, we need to transition to the absolute chokehold that the number 3 has had on romantic culture for decades. Because before there was the talking stage, there were the rules of 3.
Ah, the rules of 3. These are deeply structurally ingrained in our cultural idioms regarding romance. They were the original algorithms before dating apps existed.
Let's start by looking at the famous 3-day rule. For anyone who didn't date in the 90s or early 2000s, this was the ironclad social law that dictated you must wait exactly 3 full days to call or text someone after a first date.
Wait game.
Yeah, if you called on day 1, you were desperate. If you called on day 4, you were rude. We looked at a source from a massive Reddit thread on the TIFU, the Today I Effed Up subreddit, where someone tried to deploy this old rule, and the consensus from the modern internet was absolutely brutal.
You have to say.
The 3-day rule is completely, utterly dead and buried.
The commenters did not hold back. They aggressively called it out. One user called it bullshit for foot shooters, and multiple people accurately pointed out that it is a bizarre relic of the 1990s Seinfeld era, back when people had to wait by a landline answering machine.
Which is exactly what it is. The modern rule, according to the overwhelming cultural consensus today, is incredibly straightforward. You text the person when you get home or the next morning, and you simply say you had a nice time, period.
That's it.
We are all walking around with supercomputers in our pockets, constantly connected. We know you saw the message. So deliberately playing games with time and withholding communication doesn't make you look mysterious anymore. It just reads as disinterest, emotional immaturity, or blatant manipulation.
But while the 3-day rule for texting has been violently rejected, the other famous metric, the 3-day rule, has survived. However, it hasn't just survived, it has mutated into something entirely new.
The physical one.
Yes, this is the unwritten cultural rule dictating that you withhold physical intimacy until at least the 3rd date. To understand how it's being used today, we pulled from a fantastic article in the publication Maud, featuring insights from clinical psychologist Dr. Betsy Chung.
To really appreciate the mutation, we have to establish the historical context. If you look at dating guides, literature, and magazine advice columns from the late 1980s and early 90s, they pushed the 3-day rule primarily to protect a woman's virtue. It was deeply rooted in patriarchal panic and double standards.
Yeah.
The driving fear was that if a woman slept with a man too soon on date 1 or 2, the man would categorize her as easy, lose all respect for her, and abandon the pursuit. It was about managing the male gaze. And then, of course, the rule was globally popularized and codified by shows like Sex and the City as a sort of universal dating commandment for modern women.
But what is so fascinating is how the underlying psychological intent behind the rule has completely shifted over the last 2 decades. In 2024, when people invoke the 3-date rule, it is no longer about protecting virtue, and it's certainly not about worrying if a partner thinks you're easy. It has been entirely repurposed as an emotional regulation tool. Dr. Betsy Chung refers to the goal of this modern rule as achieving stomachable vulnerability.
Stomachable vulnerability. That is such a visceral, incredibly accurate phrase. It perfectly captures the nausea of modern dating.
It really does. Using the 3-date rule today is a deliberate self-preservation tactic in a dating culture that often feels highly disposable. People are actively using the chronological span of 3 separate dates to force a baseline of comfort. They need to see sustained interest and consistent behavior across multiple environments before they feel safe enough to expose themselves physically. It is no longer about manipulating the other person's perception of your morality. It is entirely about giving your own nervous system enough time and repeated exposure to downregulate the threat response.
It makes sense when you look at the sheer exhaustion people are feeling. People are just so deeply fatigued by having to invent their own boundaries from scratch, out of thin air, every single time they match with a stranger on an app. It is overwhelming decision fatigue. So instead of reinventing the wheel every Friday night, they are reaching into the cultural attic, dusting off this familiar, prepackaged 90s template, but applying it for entirely different trauma-informed psychological reasons.
It provides a desperately needed structural timeline in an otherwise chaotic, boundaryless, and profoundly ambiguous dating landscape. It's a scaffolding they can lean on.
But I have to challenge this logic.
What's the issue?
Isn't standardizing emotional vulnerability to a quota of exactly 3 dates completely arbitrary and kind of absurd? It is like a baker deciding that every single cake, whether it's a dense pound cake, a delicate sponge, or a massive wedding tier, must be baked at exactly 350 degrees for exactly 20 minutes, regardless of the recipe or the ingredients.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Human connection is alchemy, not a factory assembly line. What if my personal baseline of comfort requires 3 months of dating before I feel physically safe? Or, conversely, what if we meet, we have an instant, profound connection, we talk for 6 straight hours on the first date, and I feel entirely safe and regulated? Trying to force fluid human emotion into a rigid mathematical formula just seems like another sophisticated way to avoid trusting your own gut instinct.
That is a very strong critique, and it's actually one that the Maud article addresses directly. From a clinical perspective, there is absolutely no hard and fast empirical data suggesting that the ultimate longevity or health of a relationship hinges on the specific date number that sex occurred.
Right.
In fact, many sex therapists argue that relying too heavily on an arbitrary rule can actually become a sex-negative practice. It can prevent people from indulging in their honest, healthy inclinations and desires because they are trying to adhere to a script. You are right, it is a psychological crutch.
Yeah.
But we also have to have empathy for the reality of the situation.
Why is that?
For people who are actively drowning in dating anxiety, who have been repeatedly hurt, and who do not trust their own gut instincts anymore, a crutch is sometimes exactly what they need to keep moving forward without completely collapsing.
Okay, that is a fair defense. We have spent this entire deep dive so far talking about emotional guardrails. We've analyzed digital boundaries, the safety of text message intimacy, economic pressures, and temporal rules like the 3-date holding pattern. We have essentially been living entirely inside the human brain. But what happens when the assessment of sexual boundaries stops being a theoretical emotional exercise and becomes a strict, unavoidable physical reality?
This brings us to a massively important, though radically different stage of intimacy. We are pivoting away from the psychology of young adults on dating apps and looking directly at the clinical guidelines provided by the American Association of Hip and Knee Surgeons, the AAHKS, specifically their Patient Education Committee.
I love this transition so much. It is such a fascinating, jarring juxtaposition. We go from 20-somethings agonizing over whether they should use a heart emoji in a text message to older adults having to navigate the literal biomechanical return to sexual activity following a major orthopedic surgery, like a total hip or knee replacement.
And we are highlighting this specifically because it proves that the process of boundary assessment never actually stops. It doesn't disappear when you get married or turn 50. It simply changes form.
Right.
Let's look at the pre-surgery reality for these patients because it paints a picture of profound vulnerability. According to the data collected by the AAHKS, 75% of people suffering from severe hip arthritis report that their sexual activity is either significantly interrupted or stopped altogether. The joint pain, the stiffness, and the physical deformity simply make intimacy impossible.
75%. That is a massive, often invisible impact on a person's quality of life and the intimate fabric of a long-term relationship. And the clinical data notes that hip arthritis actually limits sexual function even more severely than knee arthritis because of the core mechanics involved.
Exactly. So these patients are suffering, and they eventually opt to go in for a total joint replacement. And medically speaking, this is one of the most successful, life-altering elective surgeries performed today. But the recovery process introduces incredibly strict, entirely new physical boundaries into the relationship.
What's the timeline like?
Generally speaking, the medical guidelines state that patients can safely resume intercourse 1 to 3 months after the surgery, depending on how quickly the surrounding soft tissues heal and stabilize.
But the key here is that they cannot just go back to their pre-arthritis normal immediately. There are very specific, non-negotiable physical boundaries they have to learn, and more importantly, they have to explicitly communicate to their partner. Because a hip dislocation is not just a minor setback, It is a severe, agonizing medical emergency that requires an immediate return to the hospital.
Yep.
And according to the stats, dislocation happens to about 1 to 2% of hip replacement patients, and certain physical positions significantly increase that risk.
The precision of the communication required here is what is so fascinating. The surgical guidelines aren't vague. Based on complex motion capture studies published in the Journal of Arthroplasty, orthopedic surgeons explicitly recommend avoiding any positions that cause extreme flexing, internal rotation, or adduction of the hip joint.
Because of the implants.
Right. The biomechanical danger is that extreme flexing can cause the new artificial implants to lever against the pelvis and physically pop out of the socket.
The guidelines are incredibly specific about the physical architecture of intimacy. The journal advises patients to strictly avoid kneeling with the partner behind. They must avoid kneeling on top of their partner, and they have to avoid side-lying face-to-face positions, which naturally cause the hip to flex past the safe 90-degree angle. As a general baseline rule for safety, the partner who has the new hip replacement should be positioned on the bottom with their legs slightly apart to prevent that extreme hip flexion.
And when we look at knee replacements, the physical reality is different, but it still demands strict boundary setting and vocal communication. The data shows that 84% of knee replacement patients are sexually active post-surgery. However, a major concern for them is the ability to bear weight on the knee or kneel.
Do they get that back?
The studies reveal that post-surgery, patients usually only see mild to moderate gains in the ability to comfortably kneel during intercourse, and the gradual improvements in range of motion can take up to a full year of rehabilitation.
Looking at the overall outcomes for joint replacements, you have 60% of patients reporting no major change in their overall sexual activity post-surgery. You have 16% who stop entirely out of fear or lingering pain, and only 15% reporting that they are having more sex now that the arthritic pain is gone.
Right.
But out of all the data in this section, here is the absolute most shocking, infuriating part to me. A massive, widespread survey of patients showed that orthopedic surgeons rarely, and in many cases never, discuss sexual activity with their patients after a joint replacement.
It is a staggering oversight, especially when the same surveys show that the vast majority of patients are deeply, profoundly concerned about exactly this issue. They want to know when it's safe, but they are too afraid to ask.
It is the ultimate systemic communication failure. The medical establishment, highly trained surgeons, are apparently too socially embarrassed to initiate a clinical conversation about basic human intimacy. And as a result, they are leaving vulnerable patients to go home and navigate these terrifying, potentially dangerous physical boundaries completely alone, guessing in the dark.
Which brings our entire discussion perfectly into the realm of structured therapeutic support. Because whether the medical establishment wants to admit it or not, people need help. We look at the overview of therapeutic modalities, highlighted by the Center for Growth in our sources.
Yeah, let's go over those.
They break down an incredible array of therapies designed specifically to help people navigate these exact kinds of chasms. You have sex therapy, which deals with the physiological and psychological hurdles of intimacy. You have cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which helps individuals actively reframe the anxious, catastrophic thoughts that cause them to flee the buffet, so to speak.
And they also highlight attachment-based therapy, which helps people understand whether they have an anxious or avoidant attachment style, usually formed in early childhood, and how that dictates the way they pull away or cling to partners when they feel unsafe.
And crucially, they discuss Imago relationship therapy. Imago is fascinating because it is entirely centered on communication mechanics.
How does that work?
It teaches couples how to safely mirror what their partner is saying, validate their emotional reality, even if they disagree with the facts, and express deep empathy. The premise of Imago is that we often project our unresolved childhood wounds onto our partners. By slowing down the communication and using structured dialogue, you create a psychologically safe space where boundaries can be vocalized without triggering the other person's defenses. The mere fact that this massive, multi-billion-dollar therapeutic industry exists proves a fundamental point, right?
What's that?
Human beings, at every single stage of cognitive and physical development, constantly need help communicating boundaries.
That is the connective tissue of this entire deep dive. Whether you are a 22-year-old having a full-blown panic attack because someone invited you to drink coffee in public, or you are a 70-year-old trying to figure out how to be physically close to your spouse of 40 years without violently dislocating a brand new titanium hip, the core fundamental challenge is exactly the same.
Exactly. The underlying human architecture doesn't change. It proves that emotional vulnerability is not some merit badge you earn in your 20s pinned to your shirt, and then you're just good at it for the rest of your life. It is a lifelong, constantly evolving skill.
Right.
Navigating the physical, biomechanical limitations of a joint replacement recovery room requires the exact same core psychological competencies as navigating the murky waters of a digital situationship. Both scenarios require the clear, unapologetic communication of limits. Both require profound, hard-won trust in your partner. And most importantly, both require the intense courage to advocate for your own safety, even when it feels awkward.
I mean, society loves to point fingers and mock Gen Z for their digital anxiety, their intimacy bridges, and their texting paralysis. But when you really strip it down, is navigating a modern, label-free situationship really any harder or any more vulnerable than having to look your partner in the eye after surgery and say, we have to avoid side-lying face-to-face, because if we do that, my hip might literally pop out of its socket? To me, this just proves that vulnerability is terrifying and difficult, no matter what the context or the generation is.
I couldn't agree more. The medium changes, right? We evolve from hiding behind a smartphone screen to hiding behind the clinical sterility of physical therapy recovery room. But the fundamental human need to feel completely safe while simultaneously being truly seen by another person, that remains exactly the same. It is the driving force of our behavior.
So let's take a step back and synthesize everything we've unpacked on this journey today. Whether you are currently using a smartphone as an asynchronous intimacy bridge to safely cross a massive chasm of social anxiety, or you are sitting at home agonizing over whether the outdated 3-date rule applies to your current undefined situationship, or you are carefully protecting the structural integrity of a brand new knee joint, the lesson is clear.
Intimacy is never a static achievement.
Exactly. It is a verb. It is the ongoing, messy, lifelong practice of assessing your own needs, vocalizing your boundaries, and respecting the boundaries of the person across from you.
It requires constant daily calibration. And as we look at the rapid trajectory of how human beings choose to connect, it leaves us with a truly profound, slightly unsettling question about the future. We talked about Gen Z using screens as intimacy bridges. But as our digital environments become increasingly immersive, as virtual reality becomes ubiquitous and conversational AI becomes indistinguishable from human empathy, are we accelerating toward a future where our digital avatars handle the entirety of the dating stage and the vulnerability vetting process?
Oh, wow, that's intense.
Will we reach a point where our physical bodies only ever meet in the real world for the final, ultimate commitment, long after the digital avatars have ensured it's a zero-risk scenario?
That is a wild, slightly dystopian thought to leave on. A world where the intimacy bridge just expands and replaces the real world entirely, right up until the very last step. But until the VR avatars completely take over our romantic lives, we still have to figure out how to connect right now in the physical, messy, real world.
Very good.
And if you are listening to this and looking for a way to step out of that digital anxiety and actually practice these skills in real life, you should definitely check out the Speed Mingles concepts. It is a fantastic, structured way to break through the screen barrier in a low-stakes, real-world environment. We highly encourage you to subscribe and keep listening to 21st Century Dating Decoded for more deep dives into the science of connection. And challenge yourself this week. See if you can attend a Speed Mingle event in your area. And if there isn't one nearby, don't just stay home. Contact Speed Mingle to become a host yourself, or turn your business into an event venue. Take the leap. Get offline, get vulnerable, and get mingling. Catch you on the next deep dive.
Welcome to Speed Mingle.
Where making real connections happens in
Stream,
seconds.
swipe, socialize. Your ultimate connection network.
Jump in now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Speed Mingle Network.